You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers looking to build a content engine that drives revenue. In each episode, Camille Trent interviews the marketers behind the best content marketing flywheels and uncovers the tactical aspects of content production, from first draft to first customer.
Welcome to another episode of Content Logistics. I'm your host, Camille Trent, and this episode is brought to you by my good friends Tristan and Justin over at Motion. They're an agency that helps busy B2B tech marketers launch podcasts like this one. So if you've been thinking about launching a podcast, but you need help with the production, you need help with the distribution, you need help with the design, they are the guys to call. Also, if you are launching a podcast, thinking about launching some sort of a show, serial content, you're probably going to like today's episode. Today, our guest, Tommy Walker, who's the founder of The Content Studio and creator and host of The Cutting Room, came on to talk through the logistics of media market fit and how he launched a unique B2B show that caught on with his audience. Tommy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Camille.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. You had this topic just ready to go when we were talking about what we could possibly talk about now that I've exhausted all of the B2B content marketing topics on the planet. But I think there is a pretty good angle here of what we're calling like media market fit, or we call it content market fit, right? But more specifically, like how do you build or think about the strategy behind a show that people actually want to watch, that a B2B show that people actually want to tune into, right? And I think there are very few great examples of this, right? There's the status quo of what to do, and I'll even make fun of myself as we go along. This is a classic like interview style show, right? I think that I have like a format behind it that makes it work, but I really like what you've done with your show, and I think it's a fun angle, so we'll talk to that. But first, let's give you some credibility. Tell me a little bit about your backstory. You're, by the way, the founder of The Content Studio. So just tell everyone what you've been doing before that, how you got to this spot in your life.
Sure. So I'm not going to dig too deep into the very, very beginning, but I started my career after getting fired from a retail job over a pair of pants. Ridiculous reason to get fired. I started my own freelance career. For a while there, I freelanced for about 4 to 5 years, eventually became the editor of a site called Conversion XL, CXL now. Left there after about a year to go over to Shopify. I was recruited into Shopify, very quickly went into the enterprise division. I was the 14th employee over there, and the first marketing hire on the Shopify Plus division, saw them to the first 1,500 customers, then moved over to QuickBooks, where I became the editor-in-chief of the US site, and then very quickly moved over to become the global editor-in-chief, where I scaled content to 16 markets with 40 plus contributors across all sorts of disciplines, so social, email, SEO, etc. They had a massive layoff at one point, and I cried for about 30 minutes and then registered my own business. And shortly after that, we started gaining clients like, and by we, I mean me, gaining clients like GoDaddy, LinkedIn, Twitch, and a handful of others of that caliber. And yeah, now we host the weekly show. I do the consulting as well. And that's pretty much it. That's about a 10.5-year journey right there, just sort of consolidated into 30 seconds.
That's perfect. Not a bad resume. So we'll let you continue. There's the part where, I pull a lever and then you're kicked off the show if your resume isn't up to par. But now you're in for the next round. Awesome. So here's what I'm curious about. So what is the most common thing that you think that people get wrong when they try to launch a marketing program, but specifically like launching a show? And so I think about shows like serial content, serial event, serial podcast. It doesn't have to be one of those specifically, but what do people get wrong when they try to launch serial content like that?
I don't want to necessarily go wrong because I don't like the idea of right and wrong. But what I see, and this is with all calibers, all sizes of business, is a lack of creative development in the very beginning part of the process. Someone says, oh, we want to do a podcast, or, oh, we want to do a YouTube channel, or, oh, we want to do that. Let's just do XYZ things, right? And what I don't see a lot of, and I've seen this at large companies too. So if you're in the place where you're going, oh, I just want to do a show and then I'm going to just start. There's a lack of pressure being applied to an idea, right? There's a lack of understanding of what the ecosystem is like on which your property will live. There's a not necessarily a ton of research that's being done into the audience that you want to talk to, or the people who you want to have on, or any of those number of things. And what we see, especially with interview style formats, right, is, and I fall into this trap as well too, you got to be very careful of that, is just getting people who run the circuit, right? There are people who are serial podcast guests or serial YouTube guests or whatever. And it's just talking to the people who run the circuit, relying only on brand name recognition, and then hoping that that will draw the crowd. And again, what it really comes down to is a lack of a premise, first, and second, a lack of understanding of the ecosystem that you're in, because we all get really excited to launch and to build, which is a wonderful thing. But then taking it a step further of going, well, what can we do that's a little bit different, a little bit unique, a little bit just to help us stand out within the ecosystem so we can be signal through whatever else is going on in the space.
Yeah, no, I
That's the
think
biggest thing.
I think it's a great breakdown. I think the thing that we don't think about as content marketers enough, the audience research, and then the like, who cares research, right? And to me, that like encompasses the competition too, right? Whatever like the competitive intel that you need to do. Because I think that podcasts, for instance, any type of show for B2B is still pretty blue ocean in a lot of ways, right? Like I was just posting about this of like, there's 4 million total podcasts in the world versus 600 million blogs, right? So if you think about it that way, it's like, oh, there's tons of opportunity, right? Like there's not a lot of competition. But within marketing, like within B2B marketing, even B2B sales, like there's quite a few shows out there. So it's like to take a second to think, why me? Like, why is somebody going to listen to my B2B sales show? Who's going to do that, right? And so thinking about like, what the format has to look like, what the mix of educational and entertaining needs to look like for that to work, I think is a big part of it.
One more thing that I see, and this is constant, again, this is across the board, is thinking that the show itself is the strategy rather than it being a format that needs to also be marketed just like any other property, right? Someone says, we're going to do YouTube, and they're thinking YouTube is the strategy, or we're going to do a podcast and podcast is the strategy. And it's like, no, you still have to find ways to get people to listen to the thing. You still have to drive all the traffic. You still have to have all of those acquisition, right, methods to gain viewers and listeners. I'm going to always say viewers and listeners because my show's a live stream, so you'll have to forgive me. But you still have to find ways to draw those people in, and making the mistake of going, this is a strategy versus this is another asset that we need to treat like any other asset that we have, is a huge mistake. And the massive problem behind that is you can get burnt out real easy if you don't start seeing those results right away. You have to do it because you like it, and then also have a plan to get it out there in front of people.
The thing that I got from that is like channels and medium. This comes up a lot. Like the channel and the medium is not the strategy, right? And that's important for the internal marketing aspect of this too. Of like, let's just level set on what this is, and making sure that we're creating a program and not what I refer to like task, project, program, right? Like if it's a task, like can we zoom out and can we make it like a project? So we think about if it's a project and we prove it out on a small scale, like can we turn this into a program? Like can we turn that into a flywheel, right? Like you just start like backing up and you're like, how can we think that at the beginning of like, is this good enough to potentially turn into a program and a flywheel for us? And if not, what are we doing here, right? Like maybe go back to the drawing boards. That's perfect. All right. So what elements do you think make up a good show? Like what goes into creating, this is a very big question, but what goes into creating good content? And maybe we'll narrow it down to B2B specifically, right? Because I think there are some like elements that you need to have for B2B that you don't have to necessarily worry about if you're in the B2C kind of space.
Right. So I took notes on this very question. So I'm going to take it to my content marketing axioms, right? I operate off of 3 different axioms, and this sort of everything else ladders up to these, or everything else descends from these ideas in my own mind. This is my own philosophy. So 1, a good premise will get you 80% of the way there. So that's where the creative development aspect of understanding your ecosystem and what that's going to look like to develop a premise that is completely unique. So if you don't mind, I'll pitch the premise of my show right now, which is we talk to industry leading marketing professionals about their content marketing philosophy, process, and pregame before they edit an article live on the stream, right? So it's very simple. We can sum it up in a handful of words, and it gives us the opportunity to plant a flag in somebody's brain who says, yes, I might have the same people on my show as other people might have, right? But the questions that I'm asking are very grounded in a very solid premise, right? And it gives us a framework to operate off of, very much like what you've got going on here, right? You've got a framework that you're operating off of, and it gives somebody the opportunity to wrap their head around it, right? The second one is content is a form of social currency. So if we're going to look at what it is that people want to, how are they going to distribute it, right? Or if we want our audience to distribute it, what are they going to be saying? What's it going to say about them to share this thing, right? Just like the clothes we wear is a representation of the person that we want to portray ourselves to be, or the music that we listen to, or the movies that we watch, like what we share about ourselves in our media consumption speaks a lot about what people think of our taste in general, right? There are certain people where I'm like, oh, you watch that type of, that's your favorite comedian? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
It
says something about you, right? Like it projects something about you.
Right. If someone says like, oh, Kevin Hart's my favorite comedian, no offense to anybody who likes Kevin Hart, but it's like, we might not have a whole lot in common when it comes to our sense of humor, right? So there's this, and if you like Kevin Hart, I think Kevin Hart is plenty funny, but you get the idea, right? Or The Rock is the best actor in the world.
Totally,
right? Okay,
totally, yeah. I won't go down too much of a rabbit hole because we could talk about comedians for a while, but
yeah. I know someone who was like, my favorite actor is Steven Seagal. I'm like, it's so, but you get the idea. Is it speaks to what somebody can think about you. So,
and it's shortcuts for relationship, right? Like if you like this, it's almost like our version of like whatever Spotify's algorithm is, right? Or like early days, Apple's like Genius, right? iTunes Genius. Okay, if we match on these things, we're compatible.
Yep, exactly. And it's like, that's something that if we're going to look at what goes into making good content, I think we have to take a macro or micro look. I don't even know which that would look at, maybe a little bit of both, on what that's going to say about somebody when they share your stuff, right? Is we have to think about those little bits because, I mean, our audience, we want audiences to ultimately be amplifiers, right? That's always the goal. And then you get the word of mouth and all of that content market fit or media market fit, which is what we're talking about, right? You have to understand what those moments are going to be. And you have to know what somebody sharing your stuff is going to say about them when they share it. And then the third one is for me, and this is more business to business lead generation type thing, but it sort of applies to media as well, is decisions are made in Slack, right? We have to understand what the channels are that people are going to be sharing this stuff over to really understand what that's going to look like. What's the conversation that's going to be had around this? And are we looking at this? Are they sharing it publicly to say something cool about themselves, or are they sharing it privately, right? Because we all have different sharing modes of where we share stuff. I'm going to share stuff with my wife over text very differently than what I would put out into my LinkedIn network, right? And we have to understand where we fit into that sort of sharing ecosystem as well. So what channels are you going to be shared over? And what's the conversation that you want people to be having around your thing? I don't think that's necessary. Like, you're not going to nail it, right? Nobody can nail it because you can never control what somebody's going to say or hear or think or do. But I think to make good content, to make good media in general, you have to understand those things from a meta perspective, because then it can start to absorb itself into the DNA of your show.
Yeah, no, that's a great rundown. Okay, I took some notes. You can check my work here. But the first thing that came to mind was I had this advertising teacher in college, and essentially it was like, one way that you can tell if you have a big idea, is like how I referred to it at the time, was through writing a quick like press release, or even like the first paragraph of a press release, right? And it's like, is this newsworthy? Like, does anyone care about this headline, about this like premise, like as you're framing it, right? And if so, you're like, okay, we're onto something, right? Like there's like a nugget here that we can build off. And if not, it's like, it's back to the drawing board. And so that was a good like green light type thing, or like do not pass go, do not collect $200 type thing for me. And so one way that I use it now is like before we do like these big like research projects or analyses, a lot of times it's like figuring out what the hook is, figuring out kind of like what, a post might look like, or like the outline might look like. And then you can feel more confident about spending the amount of time that it's going to take to like dig deeper into this. Once you feel confident that yes, like people will care about this, and more specifically, my audience will care about this. So that's a good use of your time, right? Is to start there. So I have that. And then the second two to me like fall under this like shareability sort of like umbrella, right? Of the first one was like the built-in distribution. That's what I wrote down for this. So how do you think about having like built-in distribution by your guest strategy, right? Of why would a guest come on here? Why would they want to help promote the show maybe afterwards? Like what's in it for them kind of a thing. So thinking about that community element. And then that third one is the word of mouth, and it's kind of the channel market fit part of this, right? Like, do we have the right channels down? Do we have the right like experts that we need to turn this into more of an ecosystem so that we get some momentum on this show? So let me know if I summarized that well. But those are just like a couple things that came to mind as you're talking to us.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the major thing is it always will come back to premise, right? Premise will always get you 80% of the way there. And that doesn't just apply to the market. It also applies to who you book for guests and how, right? This show, any show, starts with, especially if you're doing an interview style format, you start with no guests. And I think this is anybody who's like thinking about doing any of these, like I want to start a podcast and I want to interview XYZ people, you got to have a reason for them to want to come on, right? There's something that goes, yeah, that's interesting. Like, that's really cool. I want to be a part of that. No, you don't have an audience right now, but yeah, I would love to be a part of that. And also, this seems like something that I would want to share with my people. I think my people, this will make me look cool because it's going to frame me in a different light, right? All of these types of ideas. And it kind of goes back. I highly recommend anybody who hasn't read it yet. And I don't know why anybody hasn't read this yet because he's massive, but Rand Fishkin's Who Will Amplify This and Why, right? Excellent article that talks about this very concept of understanding who it is that you're writing for, but not think like the conventional wisdom has always been write for a single person in mind. And it's like, nope, write for a network of people in mind. I might be talking to you right now, Camille, but I'm hoping to really speak to all of the different people that you know and create something cool and frame my conversation around who will amplify this and why. Like, do we understand why the people are going to share this? And then everything else goes, well, okay, yep. And what's it going to say about them when they do? And where are they going to share it? What context are they going to be sharing this in? Is it something that people are going to share in their internal Slack channels versus their social media profiles?
So first off, you're not just on this show just for us to chat. Like this is not just an intimate.
No.
No.
I mean, of course, yeah. You know what I'm saying, though.
No. But I'm saying it's funny, yeah, because I get where that comes from of like this idea of speaking to one person, because you want this chat to be like, an intimate one-to-one like chat that you would have anyways, right? But then like as a marketer, it's like, why would we not share this with more people? Why would I, not want to tailor this to more people? And as an interviewer, like I think about that a lot of like, okay, based on whatever Tommy says, like, is this going to apply to everyone? Does anyone need like some extra context, right, for these things? And there's so many things to think about, like in a show, especially because it's a weird format. Like it's live. And so you have to do more of the prep work and then more of like the editing work than you would do in an SEO article, right? So it's like a completely different animal. But what I wrote down from what you're saying too is the network approach lends itself to, or this idea of like speaking to many people. It turns out there's like a lot of decision makers in B2B, right? You can't just speak to one person. Like it's going to be multiple people that you have to appeal to. So that was one thing I wanted to like throw out there.
Yeah, I was actually, so I'm editing this article. I've edited the same article probably 5 different times for 5 different companies. We're talking about customer journey mapping, right? And this is something, it is relevant to what we're talking about here, because one of the points that we brought up, and I've never actually seen this before in this exact article that I think we've all written it at least once, where it's somebody's going to be introduced to your brand for the first time, right? Somebody's going to be introduced to your show for the first time. Somebody's going to be introduced to you for the first time. And the question is what impression do you want to make for that particular person, right? So if we're looking at this in like a B2B context and getting shared within internal networks, and like if our listener right now is a junior level marketer who eventually wants to get a raise or a promotion, what are things that we could say to that person that they would be comfortable sharing with their boss that makes them look smart, right? And how can we contribute to that? And when people talk about like the audience, research and development, it's this sort of amorphous idea. And it's like, no, if we speak to this very, very specific point of that conversation or that person, we understand where we're slotting into the rest of the conversation overall. I don't think I just answered that. Like, I don't know if I jumped on that the right way, but the idea of understanding where you're coming into the conversation and who you're being shared with, and that sort of network effect that you're trying to go over. Are you trying to share, like, do you want your listener to share with somebody who's their peer or somebody who they want to impress? Right.
Yeah. No, I think that is a good way of thinking of it. It reminds me of, I've heard this now a couple times, like the playground analogy, right? Of like building, a content playground or a marketing sort of like, or content, playground for people to interact with the way that they want to, right? And that could mean like climbing up the slide versus like sliding down it, right? It could mean like that they're gonna interact with it differently than you think. And so thinking through like the different ways that people are going to play on a playground and the different people that are going to like play on that playground, right? And I think that's what you're talking to here is there's like several different types of kind of like personas within the company, and they're at different stages like in their journey, and they're not thinking about them as stages. Like they're just where they're at, right? And they might know some things over here that are usually bottom funnel, right? Or they might, other people are just going to be, top funnel if we think about it that way. But the point is, like, they don't think about themselves as being in a funnel, and they don't think about them as people on this journey, right? And so they're just wanting to like play on a playground, right? And so how can you just build a better playground?
I think it's interesting too, and we'll go back to the format in just a second here, I think. But I was just this just occurred to me that like everybody says, talk to your audience, know your audience, know your audience. And it's like, I'm an audience. Do you think of yourself, Camille, as an audience? Like,
no, right? It's like you're a human being, right?
I don't consider myself part of anybody's audience. There are people I like and I listen to and whatnot, because I'm not like sitting there listening to a play, right? Or I'm not watching a play. And it's like, and I think one of the things, and this is just more in the broader, B2B context overall, is that we also forget that we're somebody else's buyer, right? Or we're somebody else's customer. So we think our customers are different and our listeners are different or any of that. And it's like, not necessarily, right? Like my customers aren't any more special. I mean, my customers are special, but my customers' behavior is not going to be any different than my behavior as a buyer, because like there needs to be a little bit more introspection, I think, just in all of it, right? We all listen to things. We all have reasons why we listen to things, and we all have reasons why we watch things and buy things and all of that. And we, as marketers, sometimes forget that we are somebody else's buyer, and we're not like, we are somebody else's audience, but we never would consider ourselves any of that. So we have to like find that balance between keeping it personal and also remembering that there is a broader ecosystem overall that we're kind of talking to.
Yeah. We like to wear some like rose-colored glasses when it's our own product. Right?
Yeah,
Of like,
exactly.
yeah, I'm not a raving fan of anything, right? Like I'm not a fan, but other people are fans of our product, like certainly,
Right.
right? And so I think that's a good, like I like to, just bring it back to reality of like, who cares, right? Like just
Right.
on a baseline, like, does anybody care? And assume that they don't care, right? Like this is where like I go back to assumptions a lot of just like, if you're going to assume anything, like just assume that nobody cares and then think about, what it's going to take for them to care. And I think like the theme that you've been talking to quite a bit is like this like delivering value of, right? Like what are they going to get out of this? What is in it for them, right? From everyone,
Yep.
from the guests that are on your show to the people that are listening to their show who are not your audience, like really not to them, right? They are people that are they're listeners and viewers, like you mentioned, right? Yeah, I think this is a great.
By the way, if you are still tuned in right now, anybody who's listening to this, thank you so much for giving us your time and attention. On the note of nobody cares, right? Like if you are still listening to this, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Seriously, I need to say that. I need to stop like every episode, like 15 minutes in, just like, is anyone still here? Because thank you. Like, thank you for sticking with the playgrounds and the rabbit holes, the analogies that I'm going through right now. All right. So another thing I wanted to just mention and throw like some of the three things for me, and maybe you have like a similar kind of framework for the content studio or for other brands that you create. Is like just like kind of a quick like criteria checklist for Pure Signal when I was thinking about like, okay, what makes good content? If I have to overly simplify this, like what is it? And for me, it was relevance. Is this relevant to the audience? Is it relevant to the time? Is it relevant to their problems? Right. So it's a lot of that fit that we're talking about, a lot of like content fit. And then the next one was insightful. So we do a lot of data type content, research content. And so it's like, it's not very helpful to have and I've done these articles, by the way. It's not super helpful to have like a stat roundup, right? Of just like, here's a bunch of stats, like make some sense out of them, right? Like here's a bunch of numbers. And it's, oh, by the way, it's on you to like track down the original sources because I'm not going to link to them. So to kind of like combat that or go a step further, it's like, no, I need to be doing like the work for the reader, right? Otherwise, like, why are they going to pick me, right? Why are they going to care about this? I need to translate that research and that data into insights, right? Of like, why is this relevant to me? What am I learning from this? Is this more insightful than what I could find elsewhere? And I think primary data comes into this a lot for us as well. So insights, right? Like not just raw data, but going a step further to insights. And then it's actionable. So I think about this a lot for B2B, and this is where it can be different from some other industries, is like, it really needs to be actionable. Like, how is this going to make me better at my job? How is this going to help me learn how to do something that I don't know how to do? Which is why I do still think that there is merit to like a lot of the how-to content, whether it's in a video format or written format. I looked up how to do some like formulas on Excel the other day. So there's definitely still a use case for that in the business place. But those are kind of like my big three for is it good content, and kind of just like my checklist at the beginning of the process of like, is framing up like it's going to have these three things. And then at the end, like when I'm like, dotting my I's, crossing my T's, like, is it clear that this is, the actionability part, like clear? Is it insightful? You know what I mean? Did we do enough? So, how do you think about those things? And like, what's your kind of criteria for, is it good? Partly a taste, but like, is it good?
Yeah. What makes good content? This is always such a fun question because it's so subjective. So I come from an acting background, right? I spent 10 years as a career actor, graduated from conservatory and everything. So like that all starts to give a little bit of shape to the way I think about this. What makes something good? And to me, it's always coming back to, does it speak to the humanity of the person who's there? Now, do we have to state that explicitly? No, we don't. But we do have to understand what it is that we're, like the stories that somebody's telling themselves in their head when they're consuming a piece. So where are they at when they find this thing? Why did they click? Right. And then are you starting to deliver on the reason why they clicked? So Sometimes that's brainless, right? I like to read and I like to watch a lot of mindless, like comic book news or, what's happening in the Marvel Cinematic Universe right now, which is garbage at this point because they've really fallen off. But what is it? Are we just trying to develop mindless entertainment, or are we really trying to take that person on a journey? And as business, like in business content, we have to understand what that journey is and why somebody is clicking, right? So, for example, we might not state this explicitly, but somebody might read that data and research report, not because we created it arbitrarily, but because they're trying to project what's going out for the next 5 years and create plans that will stay ahead of the curve, right? They want to understand what the market's doing right now, and they want to create and develop new strategies. Okay, cool. That's one layer. The second layer is because they want a promotion, right? Because they want to look good in front of their boss, because they want to eventually rule the world and become the captain of industry. And the layer below that is, okay, well, that might be because they grew up poor, right? Like, and there's this sort of, how can we think about that, right? And start to draw, even if it's subtly, out those emotions to like really help them achieve that goal, right? It's like when we talk about this in general, we talk about achieving a goal, and it's like, I want to promote my show so my show can do the thing, right? Maybe I get more sponsorship dollars or whatever, right? Okay, that's cool. But there's like always a deeper level underneath why people click. And what makes something good is something that delivers on that reason why somebody clicks. I think another thing that makes something good is not only does it deliver on that promise and speaks to that humanity, but it also is something that just keeps me entertained or keeps me going throughout. There's a lot of skill and craft and technique that goes into some of this stuff. And it's very apparent when you pay attention to people who are really good at their craft, right? Who really focus on the craft. We spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, both you and I think it's very easy to say that people like Eddie Schleiner, Aaron Balsa, right? There are a bunch of different people. Jay Akunzo focuses on craft a lot. I just had a conversation with him not too long ago. And it's like, you can tell you focus a lot on craft and the technique that goes into what creates good stuff. Kate Borer, I think I'm saying her last name right. Very clear that the craft is something that is being worked on. And it's not just a matter of, hey, I have a keyboard and I can type. It's like, nope, there's a whole lot of extra stuff going on behind the scenes. And all of their, the people I just mentioned, if you're not following them already on LinkedIn, follow them. It's very clear that they are able to speak to that humanity, which having that ability keeps you going from top to bottom, even if it means you're going to be late for work, right? Or late for your next meeting. And that's something where when I create stuff, I try to do that. I try to make something that is going to make somebody late for their next meeting. I'm a little bit better at that when I write because you get a lot more time and introspection. But that's kind of the idea. And I don't know if I have a third one. I think those two things really boil it down is speak to the humanity, tell the truth, right? And truth is about the humanity behind it. And then two, craft and technique becomes very apparent. And then I guess another layer on top of that is, do you care? You can tell when somebody is or is not engaged in the thing that they're creating. Straight up. And some of the, I've talked to a handful of people now, and they'll say, I'm no different than anybody else. I just put a lot more effort into it. And because of that, I'm trying to pull something out of myself to make this point, to speak to that thing. And you can tell when somebody is or is not engaged. As an editor, when I was editing for Shopify in particular, but all the different places, I could tell when my authors were having bad days just by reading their stuff. And it wasn't that anything, like I could just tell what level of commitment they were having to the piece because you can see it, you can feel it. As a reader, whether you know it or not, you feel it. And I think that's the three things that make good content is, does it speak to the humanity? Are you focusing on craft and technique? And are you actually engaged with the work itself?
Yeah, I love those. The craft one really stands out because I think it can speak to you. You just talked about how it could speak to internally, like internal issues maybe that you might be having like on a team. Because as a leader, you can tell like when someone's having a bad day, right? Or when they're not like into with their craft and what else might be going on. Because it's not that they don't like writing, like they're a writer, right? Like writers
Right.
like writing, and so something else just is going on there. So there's that, and then it's also just just going back to assuming that your audience is smart and is like you, right? So you can tell, like you're just talking about, you can tell when somebody cares about what they're talking about if they've done the work, right? If there's like just craft like behind it, right? That brings
Yeah.
it to that next level. And so assume that other people can tell that, right? And instead of saying like, I can do the bare minimum and I'm good enough where I can just get away with it. But you're not gonna speak to your equal then if that's your goal, right? Speak to the highest level sort of like possible. And I think that's important for B2B because you have to speak to kind of like the whole hierarchy of the business, like at the individual contributor, manager, and like C-suite. Like you need to be able to kind of like, and this goes to the humanity, right? Like you need to have like the humanity and like the wherewithal just to understand how people talk, and that even that C-suite person is not a robot, right? Like
Right.
they are capable of missing their next meeting because your content is that good, right? And so I love that as a goal for content. All right,
And
this is
something to
okay.
keep in mind with that too, just, and this is, again, we're not talking about media market fit. I mean, kind of, maybe a little bit, but like, especially if you're trying to talk to the C-suite, there is a lot of fear that happens the further up the ladder you go, because there are more people who are depending on you, right? So there's always that like, am I making the right decision? Am I doing the right thing? Do I like, there can be a lot of insecurity in that. And as a content creator, you might address that either head on or subtly. And it's like, that has to be baked into the content that you're creating. And if you are addressing that, if you do understand that, and the whole thing about know your reader, which I hate the phrase because it sounds so trite at this point, but if you really do understand that, it can bake itself into the rest of what you create, which then goes back to the different axioms I was talking about, where you can start to understand who they're sharing it with and what channels they're going to be sharing it over and all of that other stuff. So it all sort of, at least in my mind, melds all together.
Yeah, no, thanks. Just diving into that because B2B is complex, but it doesn't have to come across that way, like with the way that we talk to people, and that's where I feel like the humanity
Right.
part does. All right, the logistics to this like media market fit, right, and to like just standing up an effective show. So I want to start out with just using the cutting room as the case study. Walk me through your thought process there from it's a good idea for me to start a show to this is the type of show that I want to create and why.
It was a terrible idea to start this show. You put so much work into it, and it's the challenge with it is you start to create something that people like, and then you're like, oh, I got to keep leveling this thing up. But take a rewind back, and don't get me wrong, I love doing the show. It's just sometimes it's a lot, and you know how this goes.
Well, the craft part like gets in the way, right?
Yes, exactly. So in the very beginning, when I started the content studio, I knew exactly who my primary customer was because I've had this entire range of experience from freelancer all the way working to old guard enterprise and, high growth startup somewhere in between. I understand the challenges of each of those. I was the person who was trying to make a couple $100s for an article to buying on the buying committee for, $1 million software. Right. So understanding that range, I said, okay, I know who I want to be going after. Enterprise level companies like to pay big money. And that's where I want to be, spending my time as a consultant. So what I did was very simple. I just did a lot of cold outreach on LinkedIn that said, hey, can I get 30 minutes of your time? Right. I'll give you a $10 Starbucks gift card, 30 minutes of your time. And I just want to shoot the breeze. And those conversations, I did probably about 4 dozen of them. And those conversations were like, hey, what's your relationship with product marketing? What's your relationship with blah, blah, blah? What are some of the challenges that you're having in your career? How do you feel about where you can get information from nowadays? Like, do you feel like you can learn stuff from people? Or do you feel like you're kind of hitting a wall because Google's not going to tell you anything you don't already know or haven't already written yourself? And those conversations were really they weren't to develop the property. I should say that right away, that they were not to develop the property. They were not to have, they were with no end goal in mind. I told everybody, I'm not looking to pitch you. Like, I just want to understand, right? I just want to talk. I'm trying to get to know people. Separately, I've been hearing for years, Tommy, you should start a podcast. You should start a podcast. And I'm like, yeah, but the world doesn't need another white guy with an interview podcast in the marketing space. Like, quite honestly, like, there's enough of that out there. And I want to do something that's a little bit different. And I was talking to Jacob McMillan, actually, over Twitter. And I was like, I would like to start growing my list a little bit, right? Just because I want to have a broader reach. And, I think I've got some stuff that people might want to hear or whatever. And he said, well, what you should do is, do a limited run series where you have people come on and you talk about, you just have people come on and you capture email addresses in exchange for that. I said, okay, cool. Again, I don't want to be another dude with a podcast like that, just, but then I started thinking, I referred back to my notes and I was like, wait, what is the thing that people are missing? And the thing that people are missing, especially when you're in the mid-career phase of your content marketing journey and you've reached a senior level, right? Starting to really dial into that group of people that I was talking to. The big through line that was happening was, I don't have anywhere to learn. And further beyond that, I don't feel like I have I don't know what other people's processes are, because these aren't things that can't be packaged up into a nice, tidy, neat SEO-ified article that we're going to actually get paid to do, right? So the whole idea was like, okay, well, maybe I can create a format that, we can peer over somebody's shoulder. And this is where the idea started to form. And then I was like, well, wait a second, that's cool. I would love to watch somebody edit because that's kind of neat. But like, how do they get to that point? Right? And how do they think about content in general? And okay, so that's philosophy. Now, how do they create stuff? That's process. And then just for fun, like, what do they do before they do the job? Right? Because like, I know I have tried to avoid it at all costs before I actually sit down to do it, because I know I'm going to put a lot of work into it. So what do I do before that? And then it was like, oh, okay. So all of these different sort of things started to merge together. And then philosophy, process, pregame, edit an article live. Perfect. And then I said, okay, well now, how can we get people in on this? If we do it, what is everybody doing? What is nobody doing? Nobody in the marketing space right now is doing this as a live stream. So let's do it as a live stream, because then we can have a level of audience interactivity that isn't necessarily there. And sometimes the audience interactivity is hit or miss. It really depends. We're trying to really form a little bit more consistency behind that. But yeah, it's how do we do something that's a lot of bit different once you start getting into that format? So it's like all of those things came together, and it was just this sort of like really natural progression from all of these disparate sort of things going, oh, okay, now let's do that. It wasn't like I sat down and said, okay, here's what we're going to, right? It wasn't it wasn't a decision by committee. It wasn't, you see that in a lot of the big B2B spaces. Okay, what are we going to do for our podcast? Right? It's like, nope. I took all of these different little pieces and then eventually threw them together in a pot. And then as we started doing it, it's evolved further and further and further, because the technique starts to, you go, okay, like the questions started to become a little bit more, the framework of the show started to become a little bit more solidified. And then, now I'm at the point where I've got this, I'm going to plug this all the time. Maybe I'm shouting them from the rooftops. Maybe I'm an evangelist, maybe whatever. But this is my little Elgato Stream Deck, right? And this allows me to switch my camera while we're live. So now we have this sort of like interactivity, because then I started going like, okay, well, I'm not the only, like, I might be one of the few people who are doing this live in, it's not a webinar, right? I try to very purposefully avoid the term webinar or call. It is a show. I treat it like a show. I said, well, who else is doing this? And then it's like, well, look at Twitch gamers, right? These people have this whole format down, right? What are they doing? And then it's like, oh, well, now we're going to start bringing in, lower thirds and, a background, and we can start to do some sponsorships and make things look a little bit different, a little bit, try to elevate it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until the thing becomes, it's good. I love doing it, right? But you start to develop this sort of muscle memory and my understanding of what's good. What I end up seeing, I'm watching my playback. I watch the playback on every single one of them, and I'm going, what could be a little bit better? What can I do a little bit better? You start doing that technique and you go like, oh, what would be a little bit more visually interesting? And then you do that for a while and you get that into your bones. It's like, working out or learning, or singing or any other type of craft or technique. And then at some point you go, okay, now I'm going to step it up just a little bit more. And you figure out whatever that's going to be because, that's what happens. And now, like, as I'm listening, as I've been doing this a little bit more, and I'm sure this happens for you too, right? Because you put a lot of, the motion puts a lot of effort into the trailers. You're kind of listening for those little trailer moments as the show is going on. And you're like, oh, make a little mental note of what happened there. And then, like, that goes into the trailer at the very end. So, and then that's how we're going to hook people's attention on the replay and like all of this other stuff. So I hope I answered the question as the case study of like how it all came together.
Yeah, no, you definitely did. And what I'm hearing too is this like, it's that craft part of it too, right? And you learn as you go, right? You have an idea of what the show is going to look like. And before I jump into this next part, I was thinking about how words matter. I still think that words matter.
Oh, yeah.
Even though we come up with different, terms for different things. But I think even just what you said of this is going to be a show, like it's not going to be a webinar. And I do think that sometimes like we use a webinar as like a security blanket to say, I can ship a webinar, right? But like a show, like that's a different thing, right? And so if I'm really going to do a show, like that forces you to kind of like level up your game a little bit, especially if it's going to be a live show, especially if it's going to be, a unique format where you're going to try and show what it's like to be in someone's brain, right? Like how do you show that visually and, walk through a piece, walk through how they think through editing. Like those are difficult things to be able to figure out. But I do think that when you frame it up right, of like, no, like we're going to do this right. And this is how I see right. and let that evolve, right? Of, okay, as we're going, I can see what worked. I can see what didn't work. I can see if I have clips from the show and if I don't have clips from the show, like you can, and you can see like what questions led up to those things. There's so many learnings like along the way, but you definitely touched on from here. I was going to say, okay, like let's apply, what you did to someone who's, wanting to start up a show for the first time. And so what I thought was interesting is usually I start with where to start, right? Like, what is that first step kind of like? And so you mentioned that what I've heard from you was you're already a subject matter expert and that you've been each of the personas that you want to talk to, right? And so if you aren't that person, like let's say that this is your job, you're the content marketing manager or whatever, you're the producer, but you're not the subject matter expert, then it's like just determining who that is, right? Is it like, is the founder, is it the CEO? Is it someone outside? Do you have like an evangelist? Determining that, right? Of like, do we have the sort of expertise to get this done? And if not, like what would need to be true for this show to be helpful and credible and all those things? And then the next thing was like, even though you were a subject matter expert, you're like, I'm still going to like take the time to interview people, right? And I'm not going to assume that like I know best and that like, what I'm thinking right now is going to apply to everyone. Things have changed, right? Like since you've been that sort of freelance writer, right? So going back like to those people and just say like, what's changed? Like, what are you looking for? Like, what's your hierarchy of needs, right? Your job is a thing that I keep coming back to too. So doing that research and like not skipping over that part will also just help. If nothing else, it'll just like help validate and give you the confidence because you're probably going to have to like sell this show, sell the budget, whatever comes along with it up to your boss. And if you can't explain like why it's going to work and who's going to listen to it, probably not going to get too far. So those are some things I heard from the where to start. Anything else you would add to this part?
Yeah. So this is actually really important. If you're trying to sell a thing, right? There are a couple of other things that I want to add on to that you really just made me think of there is I have an acting background, right? This is important because I have an idea. I have a stage presence. I have a camera presence. I know how to work a camera. I know the importance of lighting. Like there's this whole thing that goes into production that I was raised with, essentially. And something that I know from acting is that a lot of shows, your actors pull this stuff off seamlessly, right? A good actor will make you believe that you don't see the actor, you see the character. And what's going on behind the scenes for some of this stuff is you'll have on-set experts and technical advisors and things like that. So I was just watching a video about Goodfellas, right? Excellent movie. They had an actual mobster be the technical advisor on the thing. And what was interesting to me is they were talking about this one particular scene where he was like, no, that's not how you do a hit. This is how you would do a hit. And it's like, oh, that's real. So if you are the person who's trying to sell the thing and maybe you don't have the best personality, or at least be honest with yourself about your personality and your stage presence or your camera presence or your voice, then you don't necessarily have to be the expert, right? You don't necessarily have to, your host needs to be engaging first and foremost, right? The whole thing needs to be engaging first and foremost. That doesn't mean lie. That means it might take you a little bit of extra resourcing to bring in a technical expert who can make you sound credible. And that's going to depend on the format, right? That's always going to depend on the format. But if you want to create media, you have to create things that people are interested in first, which means your presentation has to be engaging. Accurate, yes. Engaging first, though, because nobody's going to notice whether or not you're off if your presence isn't good in the first place.
Yeah, no one's going to notice if nobody's listening. Right.
Exactly.
We know that for sure. No, I think this is perfect. It goes back to craft of what goes into a Hollywood movie, right? Like to your point, right? If you want to be the best X, Y, and Z, the best podcast, the best show, the best whatever for your niche, that's the level of craft to be thinking about. All right. So the next thing for me is cadence. Do you think there's a minimum cadence to get yourself going, get momentum for your team internally, but then also for the audience, so the audience doesn't forget that you exist?
That's tough. So my show is weekly. Because I want it to be weekly. Could we do it monthly? I think cadence is important, but I think as a creator, I think it's more important to me than it is to the audience, because there are things I'll just kind of take it, a lot of platforms now will surface things from years ago, right? YouTube will show me stuff that came out 3 years ago that I think is still really good and enjoyable now. Podcasts, people are going to discover it when they're going to discover it, and they're going to go through your backlog. One of my favorite podcasts is Startup, and it started years and years and years ago. And I went through the entire thing, even though it was launched in 2014, 15, I want to say. And I discovered it way later, but it was still just as engaging. I think it's a tricky thing because because I'm live, I want to say, yes, it's important. I think it's more important to the creator than it is to the audience in particular, because in a way, it's actually better for the creator because it allows you to build that muscle, right? It's like going to the gym, it's doing the reps. It's like vocal training, it's like acting exercises, it's anything. It's putting in the reps. And if you're building in public, then cool. And people tune in, cool. Are there some people who tune into my show every time we go live? Yeah. Is that everybody? No. Do I want to be good for the people who show up live? Absolutely. Will they be heartbroken if they only can catch the replay? Probably not. Right? Because again, it goes back to nobody cares ultimately. So I think a cadence is important, but I think it's more important to the creator to build the reps than it is for the audience to actually tune in. We live in an on-demand world, right? I can binge an entire Netflix series and I'm not showing up at my TV once a week every single time. Now, if it's The Last of Us or, other shows like that, we're moving back to that weekly model for some TV. Sure. But again, I can pick it up whenever I want. I'm not going to miss it if I missed it on the very first viewing. So yes and no.
I love that answer. It made me think about early on, posting cadence. I was like, okay, I'm going to post every day. And I felt like I needed that for building the muscle. Like it was really just like, so I wouldn't be lazy and like I would learn it faster. And so that was a big part of it too. And then I think it also depends on your goals, right? Like, do you have specific goals for the audience size or reach that you want to achieve and in a certain time frame, right? Like, then you probably will need to publish like more frequently. So you can go off that and then, but yeah, I agree with you that it's oftentimes like much more for me than it is for anyone else. So
Yeah.
it's like a diet, right? Like if you skip it for like a week, it's really hard to like come back to
Yep.
it, right? Exercising, same thing. So it's building the muscle is a good kind of analogy. And then the second thing you touched on is the just on demand, right? If it is on
Yep.
demand and most everything can be at this point, just give people that option, let people consume things the way that they want, and then you have a reason like for them to show up live if that's also important too. So I think about like the different, you mentioned theater, so the difference between like theater and then like watching Hamilton like on a streaming service, like after there's a difference, right? And so
Yeah.
how can you kind of recreate that for your show to make it sort of like just as magical for why you would want to tune in live, right? Or come to the show, versus binging.
I will say this though, is like when it comes to the creation of the thing, I think it's more for the muscle memory. Social media platforms are penalizing you if you even take a day off. So like there is that constant showing up. It's a matter
That's
of
true.
showing up consistently no matter what.
Yeah.
If this were like 2015, and I would say like, oh, people are tuning into their feed readers and like, that's a whole different story. But yeah, I think it's important to show up for the sake of showing up. It's important to show up and show up doing your absolute best on a regular cadence. Otherwise, the algorithms are just going to bury you, which is also exhausting. But that's the world
It
we live
is.
in.
It is exhausting. One thing that did help me, because that is true. Like you will get penalized, but to me too, I guess like I do still believe even with the algorithms that like you can overcome with really good content, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
you can't. So because I saw this with Adam and other people that I've worked with, like he would post a really good piece of content. He never posted more than like once or twice a week. And he would have really good performing posts and people would look for that, every week. So I think that's like another way is when you always show up, like when you show up with that craft, right? At a certain like level, like people are still going to look for it and tune in too. So thinking about that. All right. I'll wrap it up here. I know we're over time here. So resources, what sort of resources do you use or would you recommend? And maybe just like the bare minimum, maybe for someone who's looking to get started with serial content, with the show. So I think about time you might need to set aside, tools and skill sets, which may mean like, bringing on specific roles or help for the design.
God, yeah. So show art design's definitely a necessity. I work with somebody who's out of Pakistan. His name's Hassan. He's absolutely amazing. Contact me if you want to get in touch with him. So I think design is definitely one of the things that's super important. You could do it in Canva if you have that capability, but there's always going to be a trade-off of time for, quality overall. A webcam to get started. I mean, yeah, it's a webcam, it's some design. And then for me, I use a free software called DaVinci Resolve. Highly recommend it. It's a very full-featured nonlinear editor. It's free. I mean, they have a paid version as well, but the free version is just as powerful as anything else that's out there. And then for me, now that I'm increasing the level of the show's game, my Elgato Stream Deck, and I use OBS, which again is another free software. So yeah, what we're doing with the show is pretty bare bones as in terms of resources. I would say that the premise is more important than the tools. Always, people are forgiving of your production quality if your premise is good. People are forgiving of a lot of the little flaws and blemishes that we might see if the show itself is something that speaks to them. So if you want to start with your audience development, then get into the tools and understand the story that you're trying to tell. For anybody who's listening over the podcast, I just rolled my eyes. And then, yeah, develop that audience first and then work with the tools from there. I've seen people do amazing things with just Zoom calls.
Yeah, like I think a good theme from this episode is like the quality isn't necessarily about the pixels, right? It's not about like the background. It's much more about like, do you have a sound premise? Do you have a sound strategy? And strategy does not mean a show where I'm going to interview people, right? Like
Right.
that shouldn't be like the plan that you're handing to your boss. And so thinking deeper about that and why this is going to work, giving yourself that confidence to give yourself a chance to get that momentum. And then there are lots of like free tools out there to actually pixel wise have good quality stuff is what I'm hearing too, because your show looks really good. And so I think that's encouraging.
And here's the thing with the show looking good is when I started it, right, it looks a lot better now because I have like a fancier camera than I first started, and I have a fancier mic. I started with my little Blue Yeti microphone and my 10-year-old microphone, 10-year-old webcam, and that was pretty much it. And only once I started to see these things, like start seeing some content market or audience market, whatever, media market fit, whatever we want to call it, that's when I said, okay, this is worth putting some time and investment into. So like now I have hue lights in the background and a higher quality podcast mic and all of that. But like it got started with very, very outdated stuff. And then once you see that, it's kind of like pilot season when it comes to shows. If a pilot does well and your first season does well, then you'll get more resources. If it doesn't, then it's going to get cut. And I think that's also really important to know is when to pull the plug and have a pull the plug plan. If we don't reach certain amount of like if you know when it's not working, so don't fall into the sunk cost fallacy and don't think you have to do, 100 episodes. I mean, it's nice, but make sure you're actually resonating before you start putting more effort and time into it. But always premise first.
We call this have something worth scaling, right? So work on that first. All right, this is great. Sorry for keeping you late here, but anything that we missed or that you really want to touch on before we wrap up here?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. And I apologize for keeping you over. I could talk about this stuff all day long. I love it. So no, I think we covered it off pretty well.
I'm always good. I could keep people here longer. I always have to rein it in when I'm on here and like check the clock here. All right, where can people find out more about you?
You can find me at thecontentstudio.com/thecuttingroom. If you want to check out the show, become an email subscriber there. And we have, if you sign up over email, we have replays going out. We have writing challenges that happen occasionally. And pretty soon here, we actually are launching a database tomorrow. I don't know when this is going to go live, but the day after we record this, we're launching a database of all of the different articles that our editors have edited. So you can see all of their comments at your own leisure. And that's only for email subscribers. You can also find me at Tommy as my name on pretty much every social media platform that exists. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thanks again for coming on, and we'll stay in touch.
All right. Thanks, Camille.
Thanks for listening to Content Logistics. This episode was produced by Motion, a done-for-you B2B podcasting agency for busy marketers. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.